especially in light of the celebrations that we're having this Women's Month. President Jacob Zuma yesterday said working women in South Africa are still being discriminated against despite the strides that have been taken towards equality. Well, President Zuma was speaking at the official National Women's Day celebration, the rally there in the fuel-producing Free State town of Sasolburg. This was among the findings of government's first report on the status of women in South Africa. Research by the Office of Women in the Presidency found unfair discrimination still persists, especially in the labour market. Well, to help us to get a better understanding of the report and the content thereof on the status of women in South Africa, we're joined by Janine Hicks of the Gender Commission. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Yanda. Morning.
What were your initial impressions of the report?
I think the report is very thorough. It gives us a good benchmark. It outlines where South Africa has made great progress in terms of the formal equality that women have enjoyed and the progress that we've made since 1994. But I think what it brings critically, the lens that is brought is where are women in the economy in South Africa? And that's where issues of women's substantive equality or women's socioeconomic equality come in. And I think it points us to critical areas, and there are 5 critical areas that are highlighted where there needs to be, as the President said, a refocused, more energy and commitment towards addressing persistent challenges and obstacles being experienced.
Let's talk about those challenges and obstacles that still remain. The threefold problems that we face in South Africa: poverty, inequality and unemployment. Many people saying that, and in fact studies suggesting that women bear the brunt of that, especially in women-headed households, and that unfortunately they're not remunerated as much as their male counterparts for doing the same job, and that is what sets them off. But let's focus in on some of the other challenges that pertain to women in particular.
Okay, well, if we're looking at those 3 critical areas, poverty, unemployment and inequality, I think the report directs us there. Starting point in areas of concern relate to education. And we've made huge strides there. We have near parity in enrollment between young girls and young boys. But we have a higher dropout rate of girls over the age of 15. We're not seeing girls taking up the science, technology, engineering, maths subjects. So therefore, they're less represented in our mining, finance, engineering sectors. And we're also not seeing them taking up the higher education, higher degrees beyond, the master's and postgraduate studies. So that was an area of concern, and there's focus that needs to come there. But I think issues of poverty, access to land, access to credit, those are some of the key areas where interventions are needed. The point was made that women do suffer poverty far more than men, and not only that, but women in poverty are far more below the poverty line than their male counterparts and have less access to an ownership of property and land and related assets that could help them come out of poverty. So critically, clearly, there's a need for intervention there in land reform, and that's one of the key recommendations that come out from the study, is that we need to accelerate measures in our land redistribution processes and transitioning from housing permits to title deeds and ownership for women. When we look at the labour market, and this is one of the other markers of whether or not there is equality in a country, and we look at the numbers, the representation. When we look in government and parliament, for instance, it looks like we're doing well. We have 41% women in Parliament, 43% women in Cabinet. We've had our recent Employment Equity Commission report, which says we now have 41% women in the senior management structures within government. Private sector not doing so well, though. We're still stuck at around levels of around 21% of women in top management. So we're seeing women coming into the economy, but the critical question is, where are they in the economy? And as the President pointed out, we can't merely have women in the informal sector or in the microeconomy. If the country is going to be sustainable, if we're going to meet our targets, if we're going to be successful in eradicating poverty and inequality, we've got to see women coming into the macroeconomy, and that's where substantive interventions are needed.
And especially making sure that we see women in those critical positions in the upper echelons of managing those big corporates. But let's talk about the psyche of the society that we live in now. Many saying that while we have to some degree, achieved a non-racial society, that we haven't quite gotten to the non-sexist society part, the misogyny that we're still seeing, the patriarchy, the sexism still prevails, whether or not it's perpetrated by women against women or men against women. But let's talk about the general environment in which we find ourselves in South Africa. Was that alluded to at all in this report?
It is, and it sort of comes through in one of the final recommendations, and that's the grist of the issues, and the challenge really is how do we tackle that? Because at the core of that is the P word, patriarchy. These are the norms and the attitudes, the perceptions, what constitutes women's work, what constitutes men's work, who's doing the unpaid work in the household, who's looking after childcare, on whose shoulders does that typically rest, so that even when women are in a senior position and are in the workplace, they're experiencing inequality in terms of the wages that they're paid. They're experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace. And behind that are these embedded norms and values attached to women's leadership and women's role in society. So what kinds of interventions are needed then if we've got to try and correct those attitudes, and we've got to try and rectify those social norms, which are very gendered in terms of what we expect of women and men. The other critical issue that the report speaks to is the impact of violence against women, and how it impacts on women's productivity within the economy and their ability to engage adequately with the economy. And that's in loss in productivity, time taken up in going to police stations and courts, moving children from schools, moving homes, fatigue, stress, depression, the cost to the state of the health services in addressing women who've been victims and survivors of violence. And critically, the World Bank has finally put an estimate to that and says that can constitute up to 2% of the country's GDP. So, so at the heart of all of that are these perceptions and prejudices that fuel inequality, that then have this impact on perpetuating violence against women, that ultimately impact on a woman's economic activity and productivity.
And that's when the personal then becomes political as well. Let's discuss then some of the recommendations. You touched on one or two, but where do we go from here? So we've got this information. It's wonderful that we have it, and you've commended the minister, saying that this was quite balanced and very direct. Where do we go from here? What do they recommend?
Okay. The recommendations, I would say, cluster around 4 areas. One is the need for more data. We're struggling to track, when the report was trying to assess women's ownership of property and land, there's simply not enough data available. Typically, departments don't disaggregate data in terms of gender, in terms of race, and the geography of where women are living. So there's an immediate call for more data, better disaggregated data. That then informs our policy formulation. It helps us track whether or not we're reaching targets. So that's one key critical area for intervention. The second is around land. As we've discussed, land is integral to the economy and development within South Africa, and the need to accelerate women's not only access to land and land ownership, but access to finance, access to technology, access to the services and support and markets that would enable them to be successful farmers. The remaining areas relate to education and skills training, this bringing more women and girls into the science and technology and into the higher end of our skills training. And then we have this loose unnamed stakeholders with unmentioned activities of addressing the gaps and challenges that all appropriate stakeholders would need to engage with the report and see what role they can play in addressing the shortcomings. Clearly, if this is going to work, we're going to need to see these recommendations drilled down to a greater level of detail. And I think from the Commission for Gender Equality's perspective, what we would like to see is this report now really informing government business. We have a medium-term strategic framework, which is government's strategic plan and an annual plan. We would like to see specific interventions now allocated to departments who are given responsibility to implement these. I think what is useful for the country is that our women in the Presidency has committed to doing this report on an annual basis. So I think the starting point in a year's time would be for us to assess then how the ministry's been monitoring this process, whether or not we've had reporting on this from departments in Cabinet, monitored by the Presidency, so that when we look at our 2016 report this time next year, we're able to see whether or not there's been progress. And as the Gender Commission, we intend to follow that up very closely.
Thank you so much. And indeed, we need to make sure that the measurables and the deliverables are noted so as to measure success. Well, it's clear that every single woman in different places, be you in rural areas or right up there in the corner office on the 10th floor, whatever building that you occupy, we're all dealing with some sort of inequality and some sort of issue that needs to be redressed. And I like the fact that there are clear directives to measure whether or not we have advanced within a year's time. So we look forward to this conversation next year for checks and balances. Janine Hicks of the Gender Commission, my thanks to you so much for joining us. All right, let's leave that there, at least for now. Quick ad break.